Welcome, everyone. This is the ESOP Guy, and we are on this journey to an ESOP. This podcast and the YouTube channel is designed to be a resource to help you navigate through the complexities of an ESOP. So if you have an interest in the podcast or any other topics that we've done, please go to our website at journeytoanesop.com. So for today, if you've ever wondered what other countries do for ESOPs, I think you're going to find this episode particularly interesting. Today, we have the opportunity to interview and discuss that with a gentleman by the name of Craig West, who has over 25 years experience in advising business owners based on his background as a CPA in public practice. During 2015, Craig commenced a doctoral study on the topic of using employee share ownership plans, ESOPs, as a business succession and exit planning tool. So in that process of doing that, Craig has become an expert at doing that. So as Craig and I talked about doing this podcast, one of the things we thought would be really interesting is of course, there's some differences between the structure of what we call an employee stock ownership plan in the US versus Australia, and then kind of comparing those, but there's a central piece of this in the world of employee ownership that's going to be very similar, very much the same. So Craig has a practice called Succession Plus. It is from down under. It is from Australia. Right there, it's morning right there, and it's 5 o'clock here. So, but it's really cool to be able to do this with Craig. Craig will be our very first international podcast we've ever done. So congratulations on that. And I guess the real thing to kick off with is just tell us a little bit about your background and your ESOP practice that you have in Australia.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm very pleased to be the first international guest. That's fantastic. My background's as a CPA, as you said, and I had an accounting practice advising business owners and saw a lot of those business owners becoming baby boomers, heading towards retirement, not sure about what to do around exit. And so developed a process and a system that I then launched as part of Succession Plus to help business owners work through all of the things that needed to be prepared before they could exit. So the business, their personal situation, their finances, the management team within the business. And in some of those cases, we led to developing an employee share plan for mainly to really lock in, retain, motivate key staff within the business leading up to some kind of exit. In some cases, we've used that as a sale. So we're selling the business to the ESOP, but in a lot of cases, we're selling 20% of the equity to an ESOP and managing the rest of it within the family. So it's retained by the family, but managed by people who also have an equity stake. That's become more and more popular. The government here, similar ways to in North America, have made recent changes to the employee share plan rules to make them more attractive, which is great. So there's certainly, we're a fair way behind the United States in terms of the take up of employee share plans, but hopefully we're catching up and the government's made some changes to make it more attractive.
How many years has for Australia has this been available to companies? How long ago did they start that?
Yeah, you could do it in Australia for the last 50 or 60 years. So it's been around for quite some time.
Oh, okay.
But it wasn't very popular. It's very popular in listed companies as a reward and retention mechanism for senior staff. Most of our banks here and so on have ESOPs. That's been quite common for a very long time. In smaller privately owned companies, it's not as common. Okay. And that's where I'm doing a lot of work in that space now, educating owners and advisors about ESOP and how and why they might use one as part of an exit or succession plan.
Great. So in Australia, you call them an employee share scheme?
Yeah, they're called a couple of different things, actually. The government and all the legislation talks about ESS, employee share scheme. We talk about an ESOP, so I call it employee share ownership plan. Okay. And we've also got, unfortunately, things like ESOPs, employee stock options plan. There's a number of different names, but in principle, they're about giving employees equity in the company they work for. The same as your model.
In the Australia market, from an entity standpoint, do you guys have like something similar to a C Corp and an S Corp structure in the tax side?
Not really. I mean, most of our business owners here trade through what we call a proprietary limited company. So they're a corporate entity, separate legal entity that's a company structure. I would say 85–90% of our business owners here trade through that structure. If they're much smaller, they might be a sole trader. So it's literally Craig West trading as Craig's Plumbing Services or whatever it might be.
Okay.
And then there are some other structures around things like family discretionary trusts and so on that some people use in terms of managing their business.
Okay. So most businesses are going to be taxed that way. The majority of them are. Is it the entity that pays taxes, or is it a pass-through type of situation?
No, it's the entity in Australia that pays taxes. So if you have a company, Succession Plus is a company, and Succession Plus pays taxes on its profits.
Got it. Okay. So you guys basically the equivalent of what we would call as a C corporation structure for the most part.
It's almost the same, yeah. The only good thing about Australia is we don't have any state-based business taxes other than things like payroll tax. Yeah, so your taxation system is actually more complicated than ours. We just have one federal taxation model for all companies.
Yeah, that's nice. So only one return. Yeah, that's great. So when you do that, does the owner that sells, do they normally have some type of capital gains tax in the transaction?
Yeah, we do have capital gains tax here. So if I sold, for example, if I sold Succession Plus, I would pay capital gains tax on the amount that I've gained by owning that business. But there are some pretty generous tax concessions for business owners. There's things called small business capital gains tax concessions, which reduce the amount that business owners pay when they sell their business, as long as you meet certain conditions.
Is there any mechanism within your ESS structure where you can defer those capital gains, like our 1042?
No, we don't have the equivalent of 1042 here, which is a constant barrier. So we often look to the way that your mechanism works over there. It's much more attractive. We don't have an equivalent model here. No.
Okay. Yeah, just curious. And I think it's interesting for people to kind of think about those things when you're, comparing the two different animals.
Yeah.
And when your business actually converts, let's just say you converted it, and you said you do a lot of partial ESOPs, but when you convert it to 100% ESOP, you're not a tax exempt entity like an S corporation ESOP here.
No.
Yeah.
No, we don't have that benefit either.
Yeah. So
it just really changes the ownership from privately owned by 2 or 3 people to owned by all of the employees, but the tax treatment doesn't really change.
And when the people get the shares of stock, can you explain a little bit, like, how do they get their shares? Like in our case, what happens is we create this inside note, this internal note between the company and the ESOP that could be 25, 30 years. And so people get shares of stock over a longer period of time than what we call the outside note, which is the note that we're paying out the owner based on that bank note.
Yeah. We don't have that sort of equivalent structure. We normally set up a separate company, a separate structure. Sorry, it's normally a trust for the employee share plan. And that share plan gradually buys equity. So it's quite difficult in a lot of cases to debt fund an employee share buyout just because of the way the tax rules work. So what generally happens is the employees start with a small amount of equity and just gradually build up. I've got some clients at the moment that are being sold to an ESOP, but that process will typically take 10 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite a long, slow drip feed process, mainly because in most cases, the employees don't have the financial capacity to just write a check and buy the whole business. And the debt funding is possible, but it's quite complicated. So some people just prefer to do a gradual sale over 5 or 10 years.
So in your case, the employees are actually they're using their own money to buy the shares.
Yeah, there are some tax concessions. So for example, they can salary sacrifice. So instead of earning $100,000 a year, they can earn 95 and put the other 5,000 into the employee share plan. The company, the way we do it often is to use the company. The company the business is allowed to make contributions to the employee share plan for employees.
Okay.
So what we often do is set a profit target and say that if the business achieves that profit target or better, then we'll pay a percentage of that profit into the share plan, specifically to allow employees to buy shares. That works quite well because it doesn't rely on employee financial capacity. It's basically using the employee's effort and productivity to improve performance. And then part of that improved performance funds the ESOP and allows it to buy shares over time. Again, it's often 5 to 10 year project. You can't do that really quickly. Yeah. Which is one of the downsides of employee share plans in Australia. They're very rarely a quick exercise.
Right, for sure. Which, it is what it is. You can only work towards what you guys have, so you kind of take it. So obviously it's something that you've focused on heavily. Do you have your PhD in ESOP? I'm just curious because you wrote a doctorate.
It hasn't been conferred yet. It's actually
Okay.
currently in the bureaucracy of the university system,
Okay.
getting finalised, but hopefully in the next few months, yes.
I was going to call you Dr. West.
Yeah, you can still call me Craig. It's okay.
Okay. Well, I think it's kind of funny too, because I think a lot of people in America with ESOPs, they make it really more complicated than it really is. I kind of jokingly call them doctors of ESOPs because they make it more confusing by using a lot of the big terminology and all that. And the goal of this has always been to make it a much more accessible and make people really understand it. From the person that's listening that hasn't ever even thought about an ESOP to the person that's about maybe halfway through their transaction or deep into it. So let's talk about your research for a little bit. So when you did the research, first of all, what motivated you to even go in to do something like that?
Look, in hindsight, I probably would have thought a lot more heavily about it than what I actually did at the time. But look, I don't regret doing it. I think I was very interested in what drives people to make various exit choices. Why did some people decide to sell? Some people decide to do an ESOP. Some people decide to pass it on to their children. What is the underlying sort of motivators for that? Which is a key finding out of the research, and it links directly to ESOPs when we get to that in a second. But also I thought, the experience I've had from a very practical, non-academic sense is that ESOPs work really well. I've got clients that rave about the employee share plan that they've got, that think it's the best thing they ever did. So I'm looking at it thinking, why don't more people do this? What are the barriers? Why are people not going down the path of doing an employee share plan? And that's where the research actually started, was to say, okay, what are the original title was actually the barriers to implementing an employee share plan. It sort of morphed as a lot of research does through the project. But in looking at those barriers, that was a really interesting angle to sort of see why did we not have more people doing employee share plans than currently. Now, having started the research in 2015, since then, it's certainly accelerated a lot. Yeah. Back in 2015, it was not popular at all. I was sort of beating my drum, talking about employee share plans all the time, and no one was listening. Now it's quite popular.
Do you have the stats on how many numbers of employee share plans you guys had back in 15, and how many do you have now? As far as
look, it's still a very, very low percentage. It's in the very low single digits. In terms of percentages of businesses that go down this path, but it is growing. And certainly the government actually changed the rules in 2015. Okay. Right at the start of my research, they changed some of the rules and made them more attractive, and they're just doing that again now. So there's some more changes supposed to be coming through that'll accelerate it as well. But it was interesting because that led me to understand better why people make these choices, what drives them to decide which way to go. And one of the key findings of the research, but also one of the key benefits of an ESOP, is actually counterintuitive, and that is that it's slow. So, okay. Yeah, most people think that's a disadvantage, and actually what the research found was that's actually an advantage for business owners. So let me explain what I mean by that.
Sure.
I'm sure it's similar in the United States, but most baby boomers in Australia that have had a business for 20 years are already fairly wealthy. So, if you bought a home in Sydney, Melbourne, one of our capital cities 25 years ago, like most baby boomers, you're already a multimillionaire. And then you've got a business that's made good money. You've got some investments. Your business is worth a reasonable amount of money. So that creates a significant change where 20 years ago, when I ran an accounting firm, clients used to ask me how to maximize the value of the business and sell it because they need to fund their retirement. That's no longer the case. Most baby boomers have their retirement already funded, and therefore the exit strategy has changed from what I would call financial harvest, where the main goal is to get the money out, as much money as possible, to what I would call a legacy or stewardship type exit strategy, where clients are saying things to me like, I just want to make sure my employees are looked after. I want to make sure the business continues after I've retired. I want to make sure my customers are looked after because they've been with me a long time. What that does is changes the focus. It's no longer about financial, it's about legacy and maintaining the business and looking after employees. Yeah. Interestingly, an ESOP is a very cool combination of both those things. You can actually get both outcomes. You can get a good amount of money out, and you can make sure the business continues on afterwards.
Yeah, no, I love that. And then you put words to something that I talk to people about every day. Honestly, it's like I talk to people about ESOPs all the time, and I see that exact same dynamic in the US, where the baby boomers have made a lot of money in their businesses. That's not the primary thing on their minds. They're not
Absolutely.
thinking, oh, I don't know how I'm going to actually retire and pay for my, my groceries. So they have the comfort and the position to be able to say, you know what, there's other options.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and then when, in the US, of course, when we look at the tax side, I mean,
Yeah, it makes it even more attractive.
yeah, it makes it even more attractive. But the concept of a legacy and stewardship type of situation is pretty attractive, I think, in both countries. So I think it's really kind of interesting that's what.
Yeah, I'm getting a lot more people talk to me about how to look after their employees when they exit.
Yeah.
And some of these people, baby boomers that are in their 60s or 70s have had staff working with them for 20 or 30 years. They're really quite loyal to those people, and they honestly want to look after them where they can.
Yeah.
And this is a great way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go back to the barriers for a second, because I was curious, what in your research, did you find any specific barriers and why companies weren't going ESOPs back in 15 to now?
Yeah, look, there's a couple of key barriers that I found. The first one is pretty obvious, but it's a big one, and that's awareness.
Okay. Yeah.
Both business owners and their advisors were not familiar with ESOP the way they should be. They don't understand them. Yeah. This is 2015, but it's still the case today. We still talk to accountants and so on that don't understand an ESOP, or just blatantly tell their client, no, that's not a good option for you.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, awareness is a big issue. And I think there's also a perception as a subset of awareness that is ESOPs are for large corporates or listed companies. It's not for small privately held businesses. And of course, that's not true, but that's the perception. A lot of people, this awareness is a big issue. So partly I'm doing a little bit of what you're doing, and that is educating people about ESOPs and how they work and why they're an option.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, seriously, #podcast, like everything that we're doing on this side, and it's so important. I think awareness is a big issue here. For the US, the markets that you have in the US are very, very unique. So some markets are ESOP markets that everybody gets ESOPs.
Yep.
And like for instance, in Wisconsin, Chicago, Ohio, they're all really hotbeds for ESOPs. And the CPAs know about it, they understand it. The banks know about it, they understand it. But then, like, I'm in Florida, and it's like we're still educating a ton of people in this market. So I don't know how it breaks into Australia, because you guys have, maybe a little different geography. You're in Sydney, and then you've got Melbourne and different places. By the way, I'm in Melbourne right now, Melbourne, Florida.
Melbourne, Florida. Yeah, it's a little bit further away than our Melbourne.
It's a little bit further away. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting. So we're in the US, we're about, I'd say, though you would think we have a lot more, there's only like 7,500 ESOP companies in the US.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's not a huge number when you think about the number of businesses in the United States. I mean,
absolutely. It's a small percentage.
It's really small. And I think that is something I have intuitively said, oh, it's got to be something like people just don't understand them. They don't know about them. And of course that's a big barrier for us as well.
Yeah. And unfortunately in Australia, they're much more complicated from a legal, taxation, accounting point of view. We still require massive disclosure documents once you get above a certain size. And that puts a lot of people off, unfortunately. And I think you said it before, some advisors have got a vested interest in making it more complicated than it needs to be.
Yeah.
And therefore, as a business owner, you just look at it and think, that's too hard. I'm not going to go down that road. I don't understand it. It's too hard. It's going to cost a lot of money. Therefore, I'll do something else. And unfortunately, that's not necessarily true. That doesn't need to be the case. But again, it's part of that awareness education focus.
What does it cost over there to do an ESOP? I mean, that's
generally speaking, probably around $25,000. It could be more. If you use a law firm, it could be more. We have some startup ESOP plans, which are cheaper. You can do them for $10,000, for example.
Wow. You guys are like, it's super cheap in Australia.
I understand in the States, it's much more expensive than that.
Yeah. And here's that in the States, like what we've got a lot of parties. We got a lot of, we've got a lot of players in the Department of Labor for us, has created this process agreement where you really have to have an arm's length transaction, a buyer side and a sell side. Yep. The buyer side is the trustee, an evaluation firm, and an attorney. The sell side is the sell side advisor, their evaluation people. And then you have an attorney and maybe some other CPAs, but so you have a lot more people getting paid. But the biggest part for us has been most of the deals get put together by investment banking firms here.
Yeah.
And that creates an incredible amount of cost to it. And it's just something that I've seen personally, like doesn't even make sense because it's not a true M&A transaction because they're not adding value to it by going and find a buyer that doesn't exist. That'll pay a big premium because the trustees can only pay fair market value. So when you do the sale, you're just kind of creating it and the employees are buying the stock. How do you build the valuation around that? Is it just normal, like a normal valuation that they're buying in at, or?
Yeah, we basically do a valuation at the start of the process
that
everyone needs to agree to. We haven't had a lot of problems with valuations. We don't generally get any competitive tension. Generally speaking, it's a reasonable fair market value for the business. The psychology behind it is fairly basic, but there's no point trying to sell your business to employees and ripping them off. That sort of defeats the whole purpose of the thing. But the owner also has to get a realistic price for their business. Otherwise, it's more attractive to go down a different pathway. So we generally find a medium sort of fair market value that everybody's comfortable with, and then it runs forward from there.
Sure. So in your research, kind of, you looked at the barriers, you looked at kind of the reasons why. What are some other things that you kind of came up with that were interesting in terms of your
look, I think one of the key ones is actually, I started this research from a legal tax accounting point of view and ended up doing a lot more about the psychology of ownership.
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting point. So, this issue of legacy stewardship exits is also accompanied by, as I said before, the benefit that an ESOP is quite slow. Now, most people think that's not a benefit, that's a problem, and it can be. But when it's set up properly, if you think about most baby boomers, I read some really interesting research right at the start of my thesis that talked about a thing called role identity fusion for business owners.
Okay.
What that means is the owner is very difficult to separate from the business. And we all know business owners like that. It's their life. That's all they do.
Oh, yeah.
They work 24/7. They are the business. They talk about the business as themselves. And so separating those two things for some people, particularly white Anglo-Saxon baby boomer males who are often control freaks, but typically separating them from their business is quite traumatic. Oh, yeah. And so getting them to sign a contract to sell the business tomorrow is actually quite difficult. Getting them to sign an agreement to sell the business to their employees over the next 10 years is far less threatening. Wow. And so actually the slowness, the timing that it takes is actually a benefit to them because they're quite comfortable to gradually reduce their involvement over time. It's not like they're being thrown out or the business is sold, we don't need you anymore, old man, go away, which they hate. So really the transition to employee ownership being managed over a gradual period actually works quite well. And it's all about psychology. It's not about the financial or tax side of it.
Yeah, I think that's phenomenally important. And I'm going to repeat what you said, role identity fusion. I love that. You put in words to some things that I think about all the time with people. And it's so true. Like,
absolutely. It's a big barrier.
Yeah, it's a big barrier because they don't, people don't know what to do with themselves after they sell. And one of the things I tell people, you can sell to a private equity group or to a strategic buyer, but you're going to be out. And that door closes and you're out, so this is an option for you to be a part of the business. You can sell 100% or a partial or whatever, but you can always be a part of it. And I think that's a really an important aspect of how their psychology works because they're afraid of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even though nobody's going to tell you I'm afraid of something, they are afraid of it when they get down to it. They really start sitting there thinking like, oh, what am I going to do every day? Or they're golfing with their buddy who sold their business and their buddy's telling them, hey, I'm bored out of my mind.
Absolutely.
And so I think that's a really phenomenal, like similarity between the two types of, countries doing the same exact thing. What about kids in the business? How are you seeing that with ESOPs? Because you mentioned your family business structure.
Yeah. And look, that's quite popular now as a mechanism to protect the asset. Almost, it's a little bit controversial, but almost protect the asset from your kids.
Yeah.
So a lot of business owners are quite scared, literally, of passing the business on to their children, because there's a lot of responsibility and workload and potentially liability that they're handing over to their children, and no one really likes doing that. But they're also scared that the children might make a mess of it.
Oh, yeah.
That maybe little Johnny's not smart enough or not experienced enough or not old enough to run the business. So what we're seeing is, businesses that keep the majority of the equity in the family, maybe 60, 70% of the equity is still owned by the family, but that other 20 or 30% goes to key employees, which means it's not all on little Johnny anymore. Little Johnny's got a CFO and a sales director and a couple of other key roles in the company that own equity and are therefore incentivized to help manage and run that business in the same way that it's been. That's becoming quite popular. It's a real mechanism that family-owned businesses are using to lock in key people. Most families are absolutely terrified of the fact that someone that hasn't got their surname is running their business. But you can actually make it an advantage.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you've been doing this a long time. I have too. And we've seen family businesses that fall apart because the next generation comes in and the structure of that management team isn't like it was. And next thing you know, either they're liquidating or it's worse than that.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of fighting.
Absolutely.
One of the things I've noticed, and this is just, again, I haven't done any research, so it's just me 28 years of being a commercial banker and then doing this for as long as I have, is the generations. And I'm really careful. I don't want to point my finger at a certain generation and say, well, you're not capable. I think that the younger generations, this is just my own opinion, don't have as much of an interest to be the person that takes over and takes all that responsibility either. I don't know if you guys seen that in your research.
Yeah, it actually did come out in the research, but it's really interesting that younger group of people, and I've got two boys that are in their mid-20s, right? So that's the sort of generation that we're talking about. Yeah. They've been educated and brought up on entrepreneurial stories that we never had. Yeah. I didn't have the Elon Musks, all of the stories around Mark Zuckerberg and all of the entrepreneurs that have done spectacularly well out of owning a business. So most of that generation is very keen on becoming an entrepreneur, on owning a business, but they don't want to do it on their own. They don't want to be the guy that runs the business, but they're happy to be the guy that runs the business along with 10 other people.
Exactly, which is the ESOP thing, and
which is then becoming back to the ESOP.
Yeah, and I've had that where I'm like, I've worked. So sometimes when I do my modeling, I'll say, all right, well, let's figure out if the management can buy it and what their direct ownership looks like cash flow wise. And let's look at the ESOP and we compare the two. And, because that's how I basically came into the firm and I bought out owners, and I felt pretty good. Like that's a great opportunity. And I've had that conversation with those key people. Like, yeah, we want to be part of this, but we do not want to own. We don't want to be the direct owners and have all that risk and all of it on our shoulders. So I think that's interesting to see that, across the ocean here. What about things like, so if you go into the structure of way you guys do things, when we put together an ESOP, we're really focused too on that management group. And so sometimes we'll use a tool like a SAR, like a stock appreciation rights program. Yep. Are you guys using things like that in addition to the ESOP for management incentive plans, or what do you do to?
Yeah, we do have things like what we call, our equivalent of a SAR is called a performance rights plan. Okay. Very similar type model. So employees can buy or earn stock based on their performance hurdles, which might be time-based, might be profit-based, might be sales or return on capital or whatever it is. So yes, they are fairly common, but what we try and do is corral everyone into the employee share plan and use that equity structure. And it's often, in our case, it's differential equity. So it's not everybody has the same amount. More senior people have more shares. People that have been in the business longer have more shares, and therefore more senior people have a larger equity stake than more junior employees. That seems to work fairly well, mainly because, again, it comes back to psychology, not accounting or tax, mainly because then everybody's aligned. Yeah. One of the benefits of an ESOP at its basis level is you now have employees and owners aligned because we're both looking to achieve the same thing. Right. So if you can get as many employees as possible in the same scheme, under the same rules, with the same type of stock, then their alignment is much better because they're all aiming at the same thing, maximizing the value of those shares, improving the performance of the business to increase the valuation. On that basis, the alignment's really important.
Well, it's interesting because your model has people putting skin in the game, and ours is built around really a retirement account, which they don't pay for. And so we're going to be subject then to the rules of the retirement account, the Department of Labor and the ERISA, which means we can't discriminate. Like it is based on, you're allocated based on your compensation typically.
Yep.
But you don't really even think about touching that until you're going to leave the company,
Right.
In your case, do they have, like, we would call them beneficial owners? Those people in your ESS, are they able to vote on things? Are they able to, basically have a say-so in how the business grows and goes? Okay.
They do become beneficial owners. So they have all the rights that ordinary shareholders have, including access to capital gains, dividends, and voting rights. Okay. What we find, though, is in a lot of cases, the employees don't want to get involved at that level. They're happy to enjoy the ownership benefit and the capital gain and the dividend, but they're not necessarily saying, I think I can run the company better than you can. Okay. What we do, we run an education program called Ownership Mindset, which is actually about teaching them to think and act like an owner.
Yeah. No, I think
the worst thing you could possibly do in any business is have 200 people trying to be the CEO. That's never going to work.
Yeah.
But could they come up with ideas, suggestions, improvements? Absolutely, all day long. So it's a matter of balancing those two facts together to try and get an equilibrium where they can contribute and they're engaged, but they're not trying to take over and run the company.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something that people in this country, when they're thinking about ESOP, they're a little concerned about that issue. Like, hey, now everybody's going to have an ownership stake. They're going to want to have a say-so on everything. And, next thing you know, and they're also afraid of having to share the financials. So I don't know if you guys do that. But
that's one of the biggest barriers we found. There was two. One is the issue of loss of control, which is every business owner's concern, no matter how they exit. But the other one is around sharing the financials. And, I teach people, the research is quite clear. It's actually research out of the United States. And it was done quite a few years ago now, around employees' understanding of the profitability of the business they work for. So the average, and I don't know if you've read or seen the research, but it's really interesting. The average employee estimates that the company they work for is making somewhere between 60 and 70% net profit.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Really? Really? That's a phenomenal statistic.
So the idea of them not sharing the financials because they're worried about employees learning how much money they make is completely wrong. Because the employee right now thinks they're making 60 or 70% and they're probably making 10 or 15.
Right.
So sharing the financials to me is actually a benefit, but you're quite right. Most business owners are very scared of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for a lot of reasons, but I think that's interesting research, because some of my clients are what we call open book. They basically share everything with the employees. There's a company called Great Game of Business that motivates.
Yep, I've seen that stuff. Yep,
use that tool, and but I'd say 90% of everybody is pretty closed book, and they're very afraid of that. When you guys put it all together, is there, from a governance standpoint, is there a board of directors, or is there any major changes in the way the company is going to be governed as that?
Yeah, there's no technical or legal requirement to do that, but we normally recommend that businesses do that to start to bring in. Corporate governance is really about discipline and structure.
Yeah.
And that's good for any business, whether you've got an ESOP or anything else. So we normally encourage clients when they get to that point to bring that in. What we also do, even though, again, there's no technical or legal requirement, when employee shareholding gets to sort of 20% or greater, we normally suggest that the employees put one person onto the board. So they then have a formal role and a contribution at that level. That's more about education and succession than anything else. There's no legal requirement to do it, but it does make sense. And companies that have done that generally perform well, because it's all about understanding the structure and discipline required to manage the business.
Yeah. No,
the monthly board meeting, the reporting, all that stuff is quite important.
Yeah. I know everybody has an interest in making the business be successful and do the things that happen. So with kind of the span of research you had, is there anything else that you wanted to mention when it came to what you've found and what you think is similar in terms of psychology and that kind of thing?
No, I think the big ones were the difference between that legacy stewardship and financial harvest. The lack of awareness, both business owners and advisors, is an issue. So accountants, lawyers, and so on. We found a natural bias for advisors to recommend exits that they're familiar with. So for a simple example, most business brokers recommend that you sell the business using a broker. They don't recommend it. Yeah, exactly.
They should
not exactly groundbreaking research.
They should work for Congress. Right. Yeah. I mean,
clear.
Of course they're going to recommend that.
Yeah. And the other part of it was one of the additional findings was just around the lack of use by business owners of financial advisors. They don't see financial advisors as the appropriate person to go to for exit strategies. Now, that's a little bit different, I think, in the United States, because there's certainly more financial advisors doing exits than anything else. But here, that's certainly the case. I'm very skeptical about financial advisors, and almost a little bit of that, business owners, and particularly here in Australia, we've got a very cavalier attitude. I'll be right, she'll be right, mate. We know what we're doing. Leave it to me. Do it yourself. I don't need to pay someone to tell me how to manage my money. I'm a business person. I'm successful. That's irrelevant. Therefore, they don't tend to take that advice, which then contributes to a whole stack of other things. Around retirement planning and funding and so on. So interesting model. It
is. So what do you see the trends going to be in Australia going forward? Do you feel like it's just going to be a larger and larger percentage of companies going this direction?
Yeah, I think it's already starting to increase quite substantially. Our employee share plan business, which is about basically a third of my business, has grown by about 400% the last 3 years. So It's really taken off. Yeah, it's
congratulations.
Yeah, it's going really well. But I think that's partly because of the education and partly because the government's made some changes to the rules to make it a bit simpler. They're talking about doing that again. So that sort of contributes to it. I think also we're very lucky here in Australia. We brought in way back in the 1990s a very comprehensive retirement superannuation, we call it. So every employee in Australia, no matter who you work for, about 10%, and it's increasing each year, of their salary goes into a retirement funding account, like a 401k.
Okay.
Similar type thing. And that's happened since the 1990s. So if you're now, 50 years old, for your entire working life, 10% or more of your salary has gone into an investment account. You can't touch it. You can't use it. One of the things governments are talking about is allowing people to use that money to buy into ESOPs, for example. Now, if that happened, that's quite a dramatic change, because most 50-year-olds in Australia now are sitting on fairly substantial superannuation retirement accounts, hundreds of thousands of dollars, which would mean, now, not that they not necessarily should put it all into a privately owned business, because there's risks with that.
Sure.
But they've got the financial capacity to do it, whereas previously they probably didn't.
Yeah. And you could probably see larger transactions as opposed to the slower,
correct,
10-year types of deals. But
correct, because it would be quite easy to get 10 people together and have $2 or $3 million in retirement funding available.
Yeah.
Straight away. Now that's pretty dramatic change if that was to occur.
Yeah. Kind of interesting. Well, I'll be curious to see if your government does change the tax structure to open the door, because I think that when that happened in the United States, that just opened up Pandora's box, and that's why our transactions are more complicated, because the tax benefits are so strong, and you have to make sure you don't trip a wire with IRS, and and there has been abuse. People have abused it, of course, that happens, and so that's why there's so many different regulations now that you got to
absolutely.
So, but I think it's been a really interesting discussion, like over just seeing what you guys do differently, but also just the same thing. Like what really centers people on this is just the idea that it just makes sense for them to take care of their employees, and they have the ability to do that. And
absolutely.
There's no better structure than to share the stock with them and let them enjoy the fruits of the value of the business.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with that, thank you so much for joining me today, Craig. And
pleasure.
I'm sure people will get a lot out of this as they watch it, just to kind of like get around what's different. And I appreciate all the time that you spent with me.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's been great.
All right. Thank you. So with that, I just want to say thank you guys for joining today to listen to the ESOP Guide, Journey to an ESOP. We will see you on our next step on this journey to an ESOP.